G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Kaitlyn and I'm an American living in beautiful Sydney, Australia. If you've watched my channel for a while, you'll see that I've done quite a few reaction videos over the last year, learning about Australia, the differences between Australia and America from different videos. And even though I've been doing far fewer reactions, now that I've actually been in the trenches, there are some things I've noticed about other reaction channels that I just don't know if they truly get it. Oh, this is not calling out any reaction channels at all. In fact, I've talked to some of them. I'm friends with a few of them. In fact, I was recently on the Darting Around the World podcast with Dar the Traveler, which I will have linked down below. There are some amazing American reaction channels out there. And believe me, as an American who has had to fight the American stereotype coming to a new country, I will stand up and applaud any American who is willing to learn about different countries, different cultures. I think it is incredible what so many of these reaction channels are doing. But living here in Australia as an American compared to what it was like as an American, kind of seeing Australia from the outside in during COVID, there are some huge differences between just watching videos and then actually being here and experiencing it. I'm very lucky to be living in Australia. I'm so fortunate to be in this position to have the life I have. But after subscribing and watching a few reaction channels, there are some things that kind of bother me a little bit. So if you want to see some things that American reaction channels just don't get about Australia, grab a Bicky, grab a cuppa, and let's jump right into this video. The first thing is the connections that First Nations have with the land here in Australia. I know this is something that you can read about, this is something you can watch videos about, but I feel like until you've had the opportunity to sit down with somebody who's Aboriginal and understands their culture, you don't completely understand just how deep and ingrained that connection is. It's absolutely beautiful, honestly. If you've ever had the chance to sit down for a welcome to country somewhere and hear an Aboriginal elder explain the land that you're on, it's really a humbling feeling and a humbling moment. Over here in Australia, we have that acknowledgement to country that we do at the start of most of our meetings, where you do acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, where you acknowledge Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander connection to land, sea, sky, and community. And on the one hand, if you don't fully understand that, it's just words that you're repeating, and it could be a little bit frustrating sometimes, especially as somebody who came over here who didn't really understand what these acknowledgements were meant to do. It just sounds like you're just ticking a box at the start of a meeting. But then when you really think about the words, you meet with somebody who's Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, First Nations, and actually understand just how significant and how deep it is for them. It's really humbling and touching. You feel grateful to be here. You also feel a little bit heartbroken knowing the history of what's happened in Australia within the last 200 plus years. Honestly, until I had the chance to meet a few Aboriginal people here, I had completely different views on some things about Australia. Even just this year, I was celebrating Australia Day, and now we don't see it as Australia Day anymore. So I know that a lot of people have really controversial opinions when it comes to that particular topic. But until you've had the opportunity to sit down and speak with somebody who's First Nations background, I don't think you can really fully understand as an American just how deep this connection is. And I say it as somebody who lived here for about a year and still didn't fully understand it, and I'm still learning so much about it. But just watching these videos through YouTube, watching videos through these reaction channels, you're not going to be able to fully understand it. And I feel like until you've had the opportunity to really sit down in Australia and speak to somebody, you're not going to fully understand that connection. And even then, speaking with somebody, I still feel like I have a limited connection. But it's something that I would have never fully comprehended if I was in the States watching videos about Australia and just reacting to them. Now, this one maybe also for tourists who come over to Australia. It's not necessarily Americans who live in Australia, but when you come over, so many Aussies right off the bat, when they find out you're American, are going to assume that you're part of that American stereotype. And then you sort of have to prove them wrong. I think part of that's just because America is so prevalent in the media over here. You listen to American music, you watch American movies, American TV shows. I mean, Netflix is incredibly popular over here, and the vast majority of the shows that are on Netflix are American. So you can't fault Australians for this. It makes sense that they're going to think that Most Americans are like this, especially because Americans don't come over as often. Compared to other countries, Americans do not travel to Australia that much, especially if you're going away from places that are just Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. I've met dozens of Australians over here who said that I'm the very first American that they've met in person. And while yes, you do have Australians who are fairly well traveled, who've either worked with Americans or traveled around the States for a little while, who know a little bit more about America than, say, the vast majority of them, when you meet a lot of Australians, you're going to have to fight against that stereotype here. The loud, dumb, obnoxious, gun-loving, undereducated, overweight, just generally stupid American. You kind of have to fight against that stereotype a little bit. And I feel like once you push back on it a little bit just by showing who you are, Australians do accept you pretty much right away. But right off the bat, if they find out you're American, you're going to be fighting those stereotypes a little bit. A lot of these reaction channels hear things about Australia that are obviously in a very positive light. They hear things about how Australians are friendly, how mateship's a thing, how Australians are so welcoming and multicultural, and all of that is true. But as an American, if you're coming over, there's going to be that little bit of awkwardness that first time around if people don't know you. It's one thing if you're an American YouTuber who's coming over and meeting your subscribers and viewers who know you, compared to meeting an Australian who has no idea who you are. They just hear the American accent, or they know you're American, you might have told them that you're American, and then you then sort of have to break down that stereotype a little bit. It's just one of those things that I've had to fight against pretty much the entire time I've lived here, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. Now, this one, I don't know if a lot of American reaction channels have heard this or know this or are aware of this, but there's this notion of Australians are friendly, but they're not your friends. And I completely understand where this is coming from, because Australians, they're close to their friends. And if you've grown up in Australia, if you've made friends in middle school, high school, through work, then you kind of already have a cemented friend group, and it's very tough for a newbie to come in and sort of try to make their way into friend groups here. It's already difficult enough making friends as it is, but there's a little bit of resentment from some Australians that people from countries come over and they tend to stick with other people either from those countries, or they just make friends with other immigrants. They don't make friends with a lot of Australians. But it can be really tough making friends with an Aussie, because Aussies are ride or die. They're not just going to make friends with you right off the bat. They're more than happy for small talk. They're happy to get to know you, but it does take some time to really build up a friendship with an Aussie over here. I'm very lucky that I have some amazing Australian friends and family, and I think part of that is because my husband's Australian. They're an extension of his friend group, and once you're with somebody, once you're in a solid relationship, their friends kind of become your friends by default over here. But if you're somebody who's coming over here either for a short stay, or somebody who's coming over here with no real support system or nobody to lean on, like, it's very difficult to make friends with Australians. And that's not to say that Aussies are mean or cold-hearted or anything. I think that Aussies are just a little bit more wary. They take a little bit longer to form friendships with people. And the reality is there are some people who they've had the same friendship group since they were kids, they've been in the same clique since they were young, and you're just not going to get into a group like that overnight. So again, American reaction videos, you hear so much about how Australians are friendly, Australians are helpful, Australians are some of the nicest people you will ever meet, and while it's definitely true, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be friends with you, at least not right away. This next one is Australian cuisine goes beyond just pies and Tim Tams and barramundi and lamingtons, all the cliche Aussie foods. Yes, that is definitely a thing here. You can pop over to a 7-Eleven and grab a meat pie. There are Tim Tams in every single IGA, Coles, Woolies. Wherever you go, they're so easy to find. I've never walked into a pub and couldn't get a lemon lime and bitters at least. But there's so much more to food over here in Australia than just the typical Australian staples. Over in the States, we have foods pretty much abundant all year round. If you want to get a pumpkin in the middle of summer, you can. If you want apples in spring, you can get them then. We don't really have as much of a seasonal palette over in the States. And while you can hear that people over here eat seasonally, I feel like until you've had the opportunity to go into a grocery store and see just how limited or how expensive some of that other food is, like who's buying strawberries in the middle of winter when they're like $8 for like a punnet of strawberries? It's ridiculous. Nobody is doing that over here. People are eating seasonally. And that is so much more common over here than it is in the States. And again, saying this because I know I'm very lucky to be living here. I've had the opportunity to eat seasonally. We're in autumn going into winter. Might actually be winter by the time this video comes out. But I've had the opportunity to eat soups when it's cold based off of whatever ingredients were readily available. In the cold months, I've had summer months where everything was like lettuce and berries with a little bit of chicken and stuff thrown in. Like, you just eat seasonally over here. It's so much more common to eat seasonally, and that's not something that's necessarily a common thing over in the States. And besides eating seasonally, there is a huge variety of cuisine over here. It's not just the meat pies, the barramundi, the chicken parma or parmy or whatever you want to call it from wherever you're from. There's so much good Asian cuisine over here. There's been this boom of like American fast food places that have come up. There's a Five Guys over in Penrith. There's an Outback Steakhouse. There was a Hooters Wings. They just closed that not that long ago, which, to be honest, they're not the best wings over in the States. Here they would probably be fantastic because I'm struggling to find really good buffalo wings over here. But you can find any type of food that you want to. You can find authentic Mexican food. Yes, you're probably going to have to go to the cities to get that. But you can find amazing foods over here multiculturally from anywhere in the world, and that's becoming so much more common over here in Australia. Aussies aren't having that typical Sunday roast anymore. They're not just grabbing a meat pie every other day for lunch. It's so much more common for people to get takeaways that are based on Asian cuisine, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean cuisine. I've seen American food places popping up all over the place. In fact, they're supposed to be opening up a Wendy's here soon, and they opened a Cinnabon in Sydney, which is not that far from my work, which is so incredibly dangerous for me because they are so good. But you can find pretty much any type of food here in Australia, especially if you're within the city areas, the outlying suburbs. Australia is so much more than meat pie, barramundi, and Sunday lamb roast now. There's one thing American reaction channels, I don't know if they fully understand this, and the states and territories are different. Obviously, that one's pretty understandable. I feel like a lot of them understand that the weather's different, the geography is different, climate and the overall makeup are different. You're going to find way more red dirt out in Perth than you are anywhere near Brisbane. They understand that, but there's so much more to the differences than just the weather and the geography. There's a little bit of rivalry and a little bit of competition here, particularly in sports. I mean, just the fact that NRL is only in the eastern part of the country and then like the western part of the country just has AFL. And the fact that people constantly joke / talk about Western Australia breaking away from the rest of the country and becoming its own country. The jokes that people make about Tasmanians and the limited gene pool down in Tasmania. I feel like everybody loves to pick on Tasmania. It's the little brother of Australia that everybody else picks on Tasmania, but nobody else is allowed to pick on Tasmania, only Australians. That's part of it. There are these jokes, there's these different feelings between each of the states. And political differences too. I mean, each state has its own different political feeling and vibe to it. There are some areas where the states or territories are the ones that are making the laws here, not necessarily the federal government. And unless you're really entrenched in Australian news, if you're talking to people from all across Australia, not just in a couple comments here and there on YouTube, until you've had the opportunity to really meet and see the issues that are going on in the different Australian states and territories here, you're not really going to completely get it. You'll get that the weather is different. You'll get that each place has a different geography. You're not going to find anything like the Blue Mountains all the way out in Darwin. You're not going to find crocs in Adelaide. There are these facts that you can understand, but until you're over here and you've had the chance to joke around with Australians about what it's like in the different states and territories here, that's just not something you're going to learn reacting to videos here on YouTube. One thing that I hope these reaction channels can kind of understand, and this is talking to other Australians as well, is that seeing the touristy spots never gets old. Like riding over the Sydney Harbour Bridge and seeing the sails of the Opera House, that never gets old. I've lived here for a year and a half and I'm still amazed and feel like a tourist every single time I'm walking around in the Sydney CBD. even though I've been there dozens and dozens of times. The touristy spots, they don't get old for most of us. It might be one thing if, say, you work in the Opera House and that is where you have to commute to work every single day. I can see some of that getting a little bit exhausting. But for the most part, Australians love where they live. They're blown away by it. Australians take pictures in front of the bridge and the Opera House, even if they've lived in Sydney their whole life. So if you're lucky enough to come over here either as a tourist or move over here, you're going to be blown away by the touristy sites. But you know what? Australians are too. So this next one is a little controversial and might upset some of my older audience, but the traditional Australiana stuff, that notion of mateship, the old school Australia things that Australians used to be so proud of, is something that with the newer generations is definitely fading away. Really, since like the 90s, early 2000s, the old school version of Australia is pretty much dying out with the older population. The younger generation's becoming more global. They're accepting more influence from cultures around the world. Like, think about how many Australian icons aren't really around anymore. Holden doesn't make cars anymore. Steve Irwin was like a global icon who passed away a long time ago. I guess you have Australian actors and actresses, but I don't see Chris Hemsworth doing his regular Australian accent in Thor. Margot Robbie isn't doing an Australian accent in Barbie. Those are American accents that are coming through. It's like that classic Australiana stuff is just slowly fading into the ether. Obviously, Australia is going to be known worldwide for a lot of things. I feel like the Steve Irwin thing is never truly going to fade away. He's become an absolute icon. Crocodile Dundee, even though it's an 80s movie, is something that has really defined Australia globally for a lot of people. Just the exotic Australian wildlife over here and how dangerous it can be. All of these things are still going to be around, but I feel like the things that Australians appreciate about Australia is stuff that is slowly starting to fade away. Yes, Australians will still have sports, you'll still have swimming, you'll still have footy, whether it be NRL, AFL, whatever. Australian foods are never going to go away. I don't see servos stopping meat pies anytime soon. I don't see pubs stopping chicken parmas, whatever. But I've heard a lot of Australians also say that the stuff that they grew up on in the 70s and the 80s just isn't there anymore. One of my coworkers said she grew up in Australia in the 70s as a kid, and the way Sydney was in the 70s is completely different than the way Sydney is now. And she's kind of heartbroken that kids who grow up anywhere around the Sydney area won't be able to experience the sort of Sydney that she had. Australia's getting bigger. The population's growing here. Immigration's increasing here. So while Americans learn about all that classic Australiana stuff, the reality is in 20 years, a lot of that isn't going to be around anymore. Even the idea of mateship is something that is really starting to fade with the younger generation. I feel like people will defriend their friends, they'll chip in to help their friends, their family, but they're not going to be there to help anybody out for the most part. It's become very much not quite a dog-eat-dog world, even over here in Australia. But because of things like social media, we're so used to seeing people getting hurt for helping other people. We've become a lot more cautious overall as a culture, especially with like the millennial and Gen Z generation. While we're happy to pitch in and help out, there's becoming more of this either, so what are you going to do for me if I do? Or just overall worry that if they help somebody out, it's actually going to turn around and bite them. Just overall, things that I've noticed talking to Australians is that generally that old school Australiana is starting to fade away. And a lot of these reaction channels, they see the Australiana, they get excited for it. They see Commodores and whatever other Holden cars, Tiranas, that's another one. So whatever other Holden cars out there, they get excited to see those and talk about those. They're not around, they're not making new ones. You're going to see ones on the road and those are going to be the last Holdens out there. Along with mateship comes this idea of basically kumbaya. It seems like everybody for the most part gets along here in Australia. And if somebody's lived here for a year and a half, oh my gosh, that is so not true. But that is how a lot of these videos on YouTube portray Australia, which is how a lot of American reaction channels see Australia. But Australian politics can be so divisive now. And even though there's more than just two political parties like there are over in the States, there's becoming more this feel of voting for the candidate than voting for the political party. I didn't hear anybody talking about how they're definitely voting Liberal or they're definitely voting Labour. I heard people talking about how they're voting for Morrison or they're voting for Albanese in the last election. And while there's a larger number of Greens and independent parties over here than there is in the States, and you actually see a little bit more campaigning for those parties as well over here, it doesn't mean that the country isn't essentially run by two political parties at the end of the day. Labour and Liberal make up the vast bulk of Parliament. Most of the MPs are either Labour or Liberal. In fact, the only state territory that I can think of that has a non-Labour Liberal premier is the ACT, which I think has a Greens in it right now. Australian politics is becoming almost dangerously close to American politics with how dividing it is. And you hear, oh, Australians don't care too much about politics, Australians aren't really that political. There's definitely a political undercurrent for a lot of Australians, because you think about even basic political issues. Hell, I mentioned Australian Day and Invasion Day earlier. That's become a hugely political issue that one side or the other, for the most part, is fighting for. You take any sort of issue and politics are going to have this divisive stance on it. Very rarely do people from the same party agree on any sort of major political issue now. Unfortunately, that's the way it is here in Australia. I don't know if it was worse, like pre-2000s. I don't know if there was just as much divisiveness then, but moving over here from the States, I definitely see that political divide between two major parties. Along with that divide also comes a huge wealth gap that is over here in Australia. Just because there's higher wages here in Australia, you get more vacation time, holiday time, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to afford the Australian dream over here. There's becoming a way larger gap between the haves and the have-nots over here in Australia. I think this has become so clear and apparent with the housing crisis that has been going on for the last 5 years here, especially with the rental crisis that is going on right now. I mean, it is like pulling teeth to find a place to rent here now. So Australia has a very clear divide between the haves and the have-nots, and it's so frustrating to see because it's only been getting worse, and there hasn't been that much done to address the issue over here in Australia. And while there's definitely a wealth gap over in the States, I don't know if Americans realize that it's just as bad over here in Australia, because we talk about how many amazing things there are in Australia, and those are the types of videos that a lot of American YouTubers react to. But there are so many problems with Australia as well, and I don't know if they really fully see just how bad it can be over here in some areas. So that is it for the list of things that I kind of wish American YouTube reactors really understood about Australia, because I feel like there aren't a lot of videos out there about this. And because I at least try to be fairly upbeat on my channel, I don't want to sit there and create a 20-minute long video about the Australian wealth gap and a 20-minute long video about Australian politics and just how separating and divisive it is, because it would become very, very negative for me, and YouTube doesn't necessarily like that sort of stuff. I mean, it does, but then I become that really, really negative YouTuber, and every video I've been making is just this absolutely negative spiral, and yeah, I'm not gonna do that. So before people say, well, why don't you make videos like that? Because they're not exactly happy videos to make, and I feel like, as somebody who's only lived here for a year and a half, I don't understand the historical contents for a lot of this, and I feel like that's something that would definitely be for more of an Australian to lay their own opinions on. Anyway, that is it for this video, you guys. No shame on any American reaction channels out there. Like I said in the beginning, I'm just so grateful that there are Americans that actually want to learn about Australian culture, about other cultures in general, because I'm so sick and tired of hearing that American stereotype that Americans only know about themselves, they only care about themselves. Clearly that is not true, because there are so many amazing American YouTubers who are reacting to Australian content and just content from other cultures in general. So that is it for this video, you guys. I hope you liked it. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe button down below. I so appreciate the support, you guys, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!